I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and if you're after a 7-seat Mazda SUV but you don't want to stretch to the size and the expense of the CX-9, well, the CX-8 may well be the car for you. The CX-8 is essentially a stretched CX-5, and that's not what a CX-9 is. Even though most of Mazda's cars pretty much share the same platform, the CX-9 stands apart. It's effectively a US market vehicle, and that's the way it's sized. It is very popular here in Australia, but it is enormous. It won't fit in everybody's garage. Enter the CX-8. Considerably narrower than the CX-9, it is more maneuverable in Sydney's streets in my experience, but it's also smaller in every dimension. It's going to be a little bit more flexible, even if that means it doesn't have quite as much space in the cabin. Now, in today's video, we're going to have a look at just that, the interior, the third row and the boot space in the CX-8, and then we'll take this vehicle out on the road for a drive. Now, the one I've brought along here is the most affordable of all of the CX-8s you can buy. This is a base sport petrol. Now, when the CX-8 launched, it was diesel only, but a less expensive, naturally aspirated petrol engine was introduced, and that's the car that I've brought along today. So we'll see whether this is enough for family transport. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video. The CX-8 spans a price range that's much broader than most other vehicles in this segment. The one I'm sitting in here is the absolute base model, the front-wheel drive Sport Petrol, which is $42,990 drive away in Australia at the moment. But you can spend more than $70,000 on a CX-8 if you want to. If you want all drive, diesel, and the very top of the range model that gives you stuff like Napa leather and captain's chairs in the back. So you can really kind of make this car as luxurious as you want it. But what's really nice is that even on this sport base model, you still get a really good assortment of basic features, and it doesn't feel cheap. And one of the great things about Mazda is they tend to make their interiors plush and well finished, and you get that benefit whether you buy the base model or the top of the range, and that is true of the CX-8. So all of the material quality, the leather on the steering wheel, the plush door trims, plush down here where your leg rests, that's all standard. You don't have to spend more than the base car to get that. Where you are going to notice that you're sitting in a more value-focused trim is that the seats are not leather, they're cloth, but they still feel pretty good. And of course, in the Australian summer, this trim is going to be much more temperate and isn't going to burn your legs. So there's something to be said for its pragmatism in that way. However, this is a family car. Kids tend to be pretty messy, and you probably are going to want a grade with leather seats so they're easier to wipe down. And you do need to step at least one grade above this car in order to grab really vinyl seats, but not cloth effectively. From that point, you can go leather or Napa leather. As I mentioned, this car is really broad in terms of what it offers. Now for 2021, the infotainment package in the CX-8 is now split. The bottom half of the range continues with this older 8-inch MZD system with its old graphics that are looking a little bit dated now. It is still perfectly easy to use. It has touch capability when the car is stopped. We have a rotary dial here between the seats to control it a bit more safely when the car is moving, and the base stereo is fine. But then the upper half of the range now has the screen effectively from the Mazda 3 and the Mazda CX-30. Same thing in the new CX-5 and the CX-9, and that is a wider, higher res screen with new software and no touch capability. So if you want the latest, you do have to buy one of the more expensive CX-8 grades. However, all the cars get this mix of analog and digital gauges ahead of you. That works pretty well. We also have a heads-up display that does work with polarized sunglasses, which is good because that's the only place you get a digital speedo on this car. Practicality, also fine. Big cup holders, tray ahead of the shifter, dual armrests here that open up to reveal a decent sized box with 2 USB ports, and okay sized door bins. One thing you won't get though is wireless smartphone charging, but up front, the CX-8 is pretty accommodating. Let's have a look in the back rows. The first thing you're going to notice here in the back of the CX-8 is that the doors open to almost 90 degrees, which means that fitting a child seat into these really clearly marked ISOFIX points is going to be easier than in some rivals. Also, the space on offer in the second row is really generous. For myself at 6 foot, headroom is no issue. I've got several inches. No sunroof on this base car though. Leg room is good, toe room is really good. In fact, you can stretch out, it's pretty palatial. Where it's different to the CX-9 is in the width. The CX-9 has a pretty usable middle seat. It's a bit narrower and a bit more of a perch here in the CX-8. You do get air vents and a separate fan and temperature zone in the back seat though, as standard, which is great. And all of those soft materials continue here in the back. So if you're going to nod off against the door, for example, you're not right up against hard, scratchy plastic, which is always nice. Those back seats, they also slide, which you're going to need to do if you want to free up some room in that third row. They recline to reasonably far, always nice for a road trip. Plus, there's a center armrest, quite a substantial piece, 2 cup holders. In more expensive models, this gets some storage and USB charging as well. There's a map pocket in the back of each seat, decent sized door bins again here in the back. It feels spacious. Of course, the CX-8, the reason you'd buy one is that third row, the reason you'd upgrade over a CX-5. So I'll put some footage here of me getting in there and you'll see how it works for adults at least. Here around the back of the CX-8, you can see that it does have a design that's supposed to mimic the CX-9. However, the narrow width of this car means it doesn't quite carry off the same really beautiful look that I think the CX-9 is well known for. It still looks good, it still looks fine, but it's that narrowness that identifies a CX-8 on the road. That being said, you're going to get it into more parking spots and more tight urban streets as a result. Now this base model, the Sport, only has a manual tailgate, so that might be a little bit tiresome if you have your hands full, but of course you can get a power tailgate on more expensive models. Opens up to reveal an okay amount of space with all 3 rows in use actually, 209 litres. It's not a lot, but as you can see from just looking at it, you'll get a few school bags in there with really no issue. And folding those third row seats clean out of the way is super easy, really light, and that opens up to 742 litres of cargo space, which is a massive boot for an upper mid-size SUV or a small large SUV, whatever you decide the CX-8 is. It's a really long space in here, so you're going to be able to get several suitcases or prams or golf clubs in without too much of an issue. We've got some special features too, heavy duty cargo hooks here. Underneath this boot floor, you find even more storage space, and then beneath that, you actually get a space saver spare as well. So the CX-8 is pretty well kitted out around back. But what does it cost to run a Mazda CX-8? Well, first of all, insurance. The median budget direct customer paid $941 to comprehensively insure a new CX-8 in the last 12 months. Of course, your premium can vary based on how you garage the car, where you live, your driving history, that sort of thing. Next, servicing. Keep in mind, you have to service the CX-8 the first of every 12 months or 10,000 kilometers. Most rivals can go 15,000 Ks between services. That said, Mazda do cap the price of their services, and the first 5 will cost you $1,745 for the petrol, which is a little bit cheaper to run than the diesel version of this car. But then on the flip side, fuel consumption, the petrol engine is going to use 20 or 30% more fuel than the diesel. So it really becomes a balancing act. If you do more Ks rather than less, go for the diesel. If you're just going to run it for, about that 10,000 Ks a year mark, the petrol probably makes more sense. So what's the Mazda CX-8 like to drive? Well, there's definitely a family resemblance to the dynamics of all of Mazda's SUVs, all the way from the very small CX-3 up to the CX-9. More than most other manufacturers, Mazda are pretty good at engineering the same steering feel and even stuff like how the car rides into pretty much all of the sizes of crossover that they build. Now, naturally, a CX-9, which can push into the 70 grand sort of range, is going to be a bit more refined than a 20 grand CX-3. But the CX-8, you can tell it's a Mazda from the word go. Even in the most affordable configuration, with the base petrol engine, it's still a pretty good SUV to drive. However, is it the right CX-8 to buy? Well, let's talk about that. When the CX-8 was released in Australia, it only came with one engine, and that was Mazda's pretty well-regarded 2.2 litre twin-turbo diesel 4-cylinder that makes about 140 kilowatts of power and 450 newton meters of torque. And you can still get that engine. It comes as standard with all-wheel drive. It's the premium engine to get on a CX-8. It's also optional on the CX-5, and I've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about why I think the diesel is actually a really good motor. Namely because it's efficient everywhere in the real world. It can actually get close to delivering on its promises It has heaps of torque, both off the line and in the mid-range, so it's really easy to drive. Plus, it's more refined than most diesel engines. However, it is the more expensive option in both the CX-5 and the CX-8, so it's not an automatic choice just to buy it and shell out that extra money. Now here in the CX-8, this is a good car for Mazda because it means that a 7-seat Mazda SUV is considerably more affordable if you're happy to buy it with the 2.5 litre naturally aspirated petrol 4-cylinder engine and front-wheel drive, which is how this car is set up. And it is genuinely affordable for all of the car that you get. There's a lot of space, there's a lot of standard kit, it drives well. Undoubtedly, this is a good deal. So I'm not going to say to you that because this car doesn't have the excellent diesel engine, that means it's not worth buying. Quite the opposite. The petrol gets along just fine. It's not going anywhere fast. This engine is just adequate in a CX-5 in my opinion, and then if you add the extra size and weight of the CX-8, then obviously the engine has even more work to do. That being said, it isn't slow. It is a little bit stretched when you get it out onto the highway and start wanting to overtake people at speed, but around town it gets off the line just fine. It gets around. If you've got 7 people on board, it does get a bit sluggish, and if you're going to be doing that often, that is one reason why you would want the diesel, because diesels are great at hauling heavy loads and they tend to feel less stretched the more you add compared to a petrol engine like this one, especially one that doesn't have a turbo, which feels okay when it's just me in the car, as I am now. But then as you start to add more and more passengers, the engine has to work harder and harder, and it gets noisier and it gets thirstier as it goes. And that's not great because the engine is not especially economical, even when pretty much unladen. If you drive this car mostly in town, which of course most people are going to do, you're going to be seeing economy of 13, 14 litres per 100 Ks with the petrol, whereas with the diesel, your economy in town is going to be under 10 pretty comfortably, and then on the highway you're going to be able to do, kind of 7 litres per 100 Ks without trying, and I think those things are pretty attractive. Of course, if you're going to use the car on slippery surfaces like snow or gravel, then you'll also want the all-wheel drive, which means going for the diesel. But I think for most other people, if the point is saving money on the CX-8, getting the most affordable option, the petrol doesn't leave you feeling like you bought a cheap car. All of the fundamentals are still really good. The ride and handling is very CX-5-esque. You just feel like you're driving a CX-5 with a big rear end tacked onto it, which is exactly how it is with the CX-8. It's a little different to the CX-9, even though they share a platform. There are kind of fundamental differences in the car's setup, particularly because it's quite a lot narrower. So the CX-9 has more stability, particularly when you start driving it faster on country roads that have corners. You just notice that the CX-9 is very, very planted. Part of that comes down to the extra width in the car's track. But the CX-8 is perfectly acceptable. It's probably not my favorite Mazda SUV in terms of looks or in terms of dynamics, because it does feel quite long, whereas the CX-9 tends to shrink around you. It's still one of the better crossovers to drive in the market, no doubt about that. It's also quite refined. It's pretty quiet in the cabin, just like most of Mazda's other SUVs. And the safety features are decent. We have AEB, including reversing AEB as standard. We've got adaptive cruise control. We have lane departure warning with very, very subtle lane keeping. It's not one of the best in the business though. Hyundai's Santa Fe lane keeping assistance is much stronger. We also get blind spot monitoring and rear cross traffic alert in the CX-8, though the reversing camera is just that, a reversing camera. We don't get the 360-degree camera that you have to spend a lot more on a fancy CX-8 in order to get. So those are my detailed opinions on the new Mazda CX-8. No doubt about it, I think if you can justify the space and the additional expense of a CX-9, that is Mazda's best 7-seat SUV. That being said, the CX-8 is still a really good car. It's usefully smaller, the packaging is even better, and the fact you can option it with a diesel engine means it does have something of a competitive advantage among Mazda's large SUV set. Plus, this base petrol lets you get a Mazda with 7 seats for the lowest possible price, so there definitely is a role for it. Now I'm keen to know your thoughts on the CX-8. Let me know down below the video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.